The Bible. It's 66 books of history, stories, letters, and poetry that fit together to form God's one big story. The epic adventure of how He created us and loves us so much that He made a way to rescue us. As we travel through the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, we discover people who met God and found their lives changed forever. And now for an amazing story.
Hey everybody, my name is Billy. I am the middle school minister here at GCC. And for all of you fifth graders out there, I am so excited for you to be sixth graders coming up. Your soon-to-be peers in MSM and Crash are super pumped to welcome you, and all of your adult leaders here at MSM cannot wait to meet you. We're so excited for you to come up and move up, and MSM is going to be so awesome. We cannot wait to see you here. Today, we pick up in the book of Acts. After the day of Pentecost, about 5,000 people believed, and they were the ones who started the early church. Some of the people needed special care. They weren't able to provide food for themselves, and they needed help. What do you think the other believers did about that? Right. The believers took care of them. The disciples, those who had been with Jesus while He was on earth, made a plan. They chose 7 wise men who listened to God's Holy Spirit, and their job was to make sure everyone had everything that they needed. One of those men was named Stephen, and Stephen was a really good guy. He was full of faith and full of the Holy Spirit. And when someone needed help, everyone thought of Stephen. More and more people believed in Jesus, and the disciples continued to teach. Well, meanwhile, Stephen and the other 6 men made sure that all of the believers were cared for. Stephen was doing what was right, but some of the religious leaders started to argue with him. The Holy Spirit gave him the wisdom to be able to answer them. The religious leaders didn't like this one bit, and so they schemed against Stephen, and in secret, they convinced some men to lie about Stephen. The men started telling people that they heard Stephen speaking evil things against Moses, which it was a huge deal. The men even said Stephen said evil things against God. And when the people heard these lies, they weren't sure what to think. How could this man of God say such things? And when the religious leaders heard how the people were stirred up, what do you think they did to Stephen? Well, the religious leaders had Stephen arrested, even though they knew the rumors were a lie. They brought Stephen before their gathering known as the Sanhedrin, and Stephen was put on trial. The religious leaders interviewed men who had lied about Stephen. They said that they heard Stephen speak against the law of Moses and the Holy Temple. Stephen could have gotten angry and yelled at the people who were lying about him, but instead, he was calm and at peace. In fact, his face was like the face of an angel. Well, Stephen didn't worry about what others were saying about him because he knew the truth. The high priest asked Stephen if these accusations were true, and Stephen wanted the leaders to understand the truth about Jesus. He knew that God was with him, and he was filled with courage. So even though he knew the religious leaders could kill him, Stephen spoke with boldness and told them how Jesus was the most important part of a plan that God had set into motion with Abraham so long ago. Stephen reminded them how God called Abraham to move away from his homeland to a place that God would give him. And through Abraham's descendants, God kept His promise. Abraham's son Jacob had 12 sons. One was Joseph, who was sold into slavery and then became second in command to Pharaoh. And through Joseph, God saved His people. And eventually, God's people became slaves in Egypt. And again, God saved His people. This time, it was through Moses. And finally, the people arrived in the land that God had promised. So Stephen went on to tell the religious leaders about King David, who loved God so much he wanted to build him a beautiful temple. And lastly, he told them about Jesus. He said, "You stubborn people, you won't obey, you won't listen. You are just like your people of long ago. You always oppose the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your people didn't try to hurt? They even killed those who told them about the coming of the blameless one. And Now you have handed him over to his enemies. You have murdered him." Even though Stephen spoke the truth about Jesus, the religious leaders were very angry. God knew what was in their hearts, and so he gave Stephen a vision of heaven. He allowed Stephen to see something that no one else there could see. Stephen looked up and saw Jesus standing with God. Can you imagine seeing what heaven looks like? But the religious leaders didn't want to hear another word from Stephen. They covered their ears and they yelled. I'll tell you what happened next. It was very sad. The religious leaders dragged Stephen out of the city. They left their coats with a man named Saul, and they all started throwing stones at Stephen, trying to kill him. While they did this, Stephen prayed to God. He asked God not to hold this horrible act against the people. He asked God to forgive them for their sins. What faith! Even though Stephen had only done what was right, he died that day. And Jesus had told his followers to live out his love everywhere, no matter what. Through God's power, Stephen had continued to share God's love all the way until his very last breath. What happened to Stephen was terrible and very sad. Maybe it wasn't how you expected the story to go, but the good news is it wasn't the end of the story. Remember, God showed Stephen a vision. Stephen knew that when he died, he would be with Jesus in heaven. And Stephen was able to keep going because he knew that God was with him. And you and I need to remember that too. We know for sure how God's one big story ends. In the end, those who follow Jesus will be with God forever in heaven.
God always has a big plan, a bigger story. It's like Stephen said when he was talking to the religious leaders. Abraham, Moses, and David didn't know the end of the story, but they all trusted God along the way. We can look at the Bible now and read their stories. We can see how God was faithful and came through for his people. We also know that God kept his promise and sent Jesus to save us. Stephen knew this too. He bravely taught others about Jesus, no matter the cost. Even though Stephen didn't know how things would end, he trusted God. He decided to stand strong in what he believed. Stephen died in an awful way, but because of his faith, he went to heaven to be with God. Sometimes you go through difficult things where you can't see the end of the story, and that can be scary. When everything feels awful, talk to God. If you're scared and not sure how things will turn out, tell him how you feel. Ask him to give you the strength to keep going. You can also talk to an adult you trust. You don't have to do it all alone. Don't keep it to yourself. Instead, find strength like Stephen did by looking to God.